project that you guys are going to be assigned today. With this, it is a project where you're going to look over an important person, an important group, event, historical topic from the civil rights movement. You're going to create an electronic display that describes your person, group, event, historical topic of significance. So this doesn't need to be, it doesn't need to be like a 7-page long paper, though if you want to go the paper route, you can. It could be a PowerPoint. It could be a video if you're more interested in, I know some of you guys do video production, you do it pretty well. So if you're more interested in videos, you could do that. If you do just want to do a PowerPoint, that's totally fine. If you want to have like a big, and I've made one of these before, like a digital poster, that is also cool. The only thing that you're going to want to do is make sure that you look through these project directions and notes. With this, you have all these different topics to choose from. So today, if you didn't catch on, we're starting the civil rights movement. So we'll talk about some of these people on this list. We'll talk about some of these groups as well today. Certain people like Emmett Till, Jackie Robinson. If you're more interested in, I don't know, Jackie Robinson's really good at, with the discussion of breaking down the color barrier in baseball. But if you're more interested in, football or something like that, or maybe you're not interested in sports, maybe you're interested in politics more than anything else, you can pick whoever you want. If they're not on the list, all I ask is that you just get a hold of me and ask me, can I use this person? 9.5 times out of 10, I'm probably going to say yes, as long as they're involved in some sort of civil rights movement, or I guess in progressing civil rights in general. So I had somebody email me yesterday and they asked me if they could use somebody else, and I was totally cool with it, and I probably will be 95% of the time. So you'll look through, you'll pick something from this group. If you don't want to do anything on these topics, you can do a different one. Step 2, you'll research your person. And the biggest thing, this is probably the only thing, honestly, on this that'll give you guys a headache, but it is necessary, is to use MLA format with your citations. I know it sucks, I do, but I'll tell you right now, it is something that I myself wish that they actually taught me to utilize and practice with in high school more often. Yeah.
If you guys remember back in middle school, there was a website.
Yeah, you can use bibliography.com. You can use Citation Machine. I'm not going to give you a hard time on that. Yeah.
Also, fun tip that I found out: if you use scholarly Google or whatever,
yeah, you can get the citations on there.
You can hover over it or something,
You have
and
a lot of water
then you get any kind of citation.
I know more about.
Yeah, you can. So there's a lot of ways to go about this, and honestly, I know it says MLA on there. If you want. And I'm sure you guys aren't at this point, but if you're more well-versed with APA or Chicago or any other type of format, you might be, you might not be. The thing that I found when I got to college is that all throughout high school, my teachers were like, MLA, MLA, MLA. And then I get to college and they're like, all right, now write this in Chicago and APA. I'm like, I have no idea what the hell that means. So if you want to go that route, personally, I like for history, Chicago is usually a bit better. That's where you use footnotes and stuff like that. But if you want to do MLA is fine with me. That's what the project calls for. But if you want to do something else, that's also totally cool. Like was said, if you want to use you're fine to use a different website that helps you kind of generate these two. I likely, honestly, throughout all of this, I'm probably not going to mark you off if you have mistakes in your citations too much, because I think this is a better point of practice than anything else. So just do your best on your citations, do your best to get them correct, and just don't worry. As long as you're not, committing plagiarism, then you're fine, pretty much, okay? So I probably won't mark you off on points on that, but you are likely to get maybe feedback from me on it. So you'll get the points for your citations as long as you give a good effort for it, but if they're wrong or something, I might just let you know. Is pretty much where I'm at with that, okay? So maybe to ease the headache with that a little bit. Other than that, step 3, you can make a PowerPoint, newspaper article, research paper, battle brochure, a memoir acting as someone who lived through the event or lifetime. You could literally do anything. If it's not on this list, again, just reach out to me and ask me. If you want to make a YouTube video, if you want to make a movie poster or something that depicts it, that might be cool for you, Van, if you're always making movie posters and stuff. As long as you can answer the questions that go with this, and as long as you can answer the things right here in step 4, maybe you need 2 slides or 3 slides, whatever you might need. As long as you answer these questions, that's all I really care about, okay? So the purpose of this is to get more involved and to get a little bit more information about some of these things. So if you're doing a person, you'd basically go through this document and you'd answer these questions, these 6 questions here. If you have a PowerPoint, you could do like slide 1, question 1. Slide 2, question 2, and I'd see that there's a missing question on this one, but don't worry about that. So there should be 5 here. And the same thing goes for all these as well, all the way down to historical topics. And then step 5, you have your works cited, and that is where you will do MLA format. So I know it says don't copy from any website. I don't quite mind, to be honest. If you use that, that is something that I used in college. I used websites in college. I used websites in high school. It is good for you to know those things, but realistically, the best is that you know how to create them correctly and that they're formatted correctly. So if you want to use a website, that is okay with me. But yeah. All right. Are we clear on that? Does that make sense? It's really not that in-depth of a project, but it's more so just getting you some background knowledge on some of these different people and events. Yeah.
So how do we tell you when we know who we want to name?
You can just pick. If it's on the list, then you can just use it.
So it doesn't have to
Oh, so we
be,
don't have to like.
No, you don't have to tell me.
Oh.
You don't have to tell me.
so it can be like duplicates.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The only thing is that with that, obviously it's not a group project. It's a single person project. So if you're working on something same as somebody else, that's fine. Maybe you can consult them for, hey, did you find this or that? But don't be like copying word for word or anything like that. Okay. But it's not like I'm not going to assign you guys these. You can choose one of these topics. And if more than one person tends to choose a topic, that's okay. All right. Sound good? So let's go ahead and jump into these notes. Yeah, sure, if you want to get one. Yeah, there's a hard copy of notes up there if you want it.
So are we gonna do the entire packet?
Yeah, today's just day 1. So we'll get through that today.
Just day 1.
Yeah, just day 1.
Is it Congress or is it the other one?
Other one.
Reconstruction amendments?
So we're going to talk about a couple of things today. Some of the things that we talk about today, obviously, is pretty heavy stuff, given that it's the civil rights movement. Some of the situations. You guys all right?
Yeah, there's water.
You need paper towels?
Whoa. Okay, my bag is all up now. This is like a food. Yeah.
You can leave it for now. If you want to get it later. There's these. Just don't slip, all right? Some of the topics today are a bit heavy, obviously, like I said, because it's the civil rights movement, and there are, we're going to deal with topics of racism, discrimination. We'll talk about, I think the hardest thing for me to talk about today is Emmett Till. It's a very difficult situation to look through and talk about. Has anybody ever heard of Emmett Till? It's a tough situation. It is genuinely, it's heartbreaking in many ways. But it is important to kind of go through and talk about that as well. So that'll be towards the end of the notes today. With that, I have the image. Yeah.
Can we watch Hidden Figures by any chance?
If we have room for it in the curriculum, I'm kind of operating with what Mrs. Miller's got set up for me, so we'll see. If there's room or there's extra time or something, then I'm open to it. I don't mind. So I'll see. But anyways, with Emmett Till, I do have an image of Emmett Till. It's a very horrifying image, genuinely, but given the nature of the crime, given the nature of the open casket surrounding Emmett Till and the implications and the momentum that Emmett Till's death has brought to the civil rights movement, it is probably important for you guys to see that as well. So we will see that for a moment. Just a fair warning, it is pretty graphic and it's very, very sad to look at as well. So do be prepared for that a little bit later on. In the beginning, though, taking a look at day 1, taking a look at the civil rights movement, we remember this idea of separate but equal, right? This argument of, hey, it's okay if things are separated and segregated as long as they're equal. And I think this picture right here is a fantastic representation of how complete BS the idea of separate but equal is, right? You can see a water fountain here and you'll see a lot of separations today between like white-only areas or black-only areas, white-only water fountains, black-only water fountains. And you can see the difference very clearly here, the difference between the quality of things that are being offered to each group. You can see the difference in a couple other images that we'll see today as well. Blacks-only outhouses and areas like that you see where it's very obviously run down or in a terrible area or situation where people have just been kind of pushed to the side more than anything. So we'll see a lot of that today. We'll see a lot of separation. We'll see a lot of discrimination. We'll see a lot of racism. Some racism backed by law, believe it or not, a large amount of legalized racism. And then also racism that is, more de jure than anything else, or de facto, I mean. So we'll talk about post-Civil War. We'll talk about segregation, de jure and de facto. There's the two differences there. We'll talk about 1940s with World War II. Talk about Brown v. Board of Education, the Montgomery bus boycotts, the OG Rosa Parks, nonviolent protests with MLK. We have Emmett Till again at the end, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1957. At the end, there is an exit ticket, but it is just an extra credit quiz. So if you want to take it, take it. It's 5 points extra credit. You get 3 attempts. You get the points if you get them right. There's no reason you shouldn't get all the points because it's 3 attempts and it's multiple choice. So take it if you want to. And then after that, if we have any free time, you can work on that Unit 10 project or at least get an idea. I think with the other classes, the main thing I had was at least pick who you want to do today maybe, or get an idea of what you want to do. So, the Reconstruction Amendments, looking at this, we have the 13. These are amendments that are put in immediately following the Civil War. Reconstruction is this period of time following the Civil War where we're rebuilding, right? We're rebuilding. It's a period of recovery. During this time immediately following the Civil War, we see a large amount of steps in the correct direction in terms of less law-backed discrimination, though at the same time, and as I'll say many times, I don't want to be pessimistic on many of these things. There is just still a large amount of improvement that needs to be done. There's a lot of, we've come a great distance, but the race is not yet over, right? I may. So there's still much to be done. There are still some issues with many of these things as well. Things like, you wouldn't think that something like the 13th Amendment would have its issues, but it does have its own, even with the abolishment of slavery. Reason being is because unless you were found, this is the way that the 13th Amendment is phrased. Has anybody ever seen the film 13th? No, it's on YouTube. It's produced by Netflix, I believe. It's a really, really good documentary. With the 13th Amendment, obviously it abolishes slavery, but it puts in this clause. It puts in the clause of, yes, slavery, indentured, involuntary servitude, all these things are abolished unless, does anybody know? Any idea? Unless you're found guilty of a criminal defense or a criminal offense, right? So yes, slavery is illegal unless you're a prisoner, essentially, right? And so that leads into a lot of issues. If anybody knows anything about the criminal justice system in the United States, there are many points of contention there, right? On top of that, something like the 13th Amendment, not to say that obviously abolishing slavery is a fantastic thing, get rid of it. But at the same time, we have some issues with it as well. Wording leading to things like mass incarceration, issues there. Also issues with prisoners. If you know anything about like license plates and stuff, oftentimes maybe being built by prisoners or created by prisoners, they're getting paid like cents on the dollar. There is not really a certified minimum wage. So that in itself is borderline, akin to some slave labor there as well. So it's interesting to see the outcomes of that as well. We see things like the 14th Amendment with African-American citizenship, and then the 15th with African-American suffrage. Does anybody know what suffrage is? Voting, right? The right to vote. So we do see that. We see, again, like I said, steps in the right direction, but at the same time, some of these things only hold up for a short amount of time. If you know anything about African-American suffrage, there's so many more issues that come with that based on the idea of like literacy tests, based on poll taxes and other forms of basically racism and discrimination to stop African-Americans from voting, even though they have the right to do it within the Constitution. So you'll see that as well. We have Plessy versus Ferguson. This is a landmark 1986 Supreme Court case, 1896. Landmark 1896. Yeah, I think I accidentally messed it up on the notes, so don't worry. Just move it around. Yeah. Landmark 1896 U.S. Supreme Court decision that upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. So when we say upheld, that means that it is confirming. It is basically saying that separate but equal is fine, right? It says that segregation is allowed as long as things are separate but equal. However, as you know, separate but equal is inherently unequal. Rejecting Plessy's argument that his constitutional rights were violated, the Supreme Court ruled that a law that implies merely a legal distinction between white people and black people was not unconstitutional. So they're basically saying that legal distinctions between whites and blacks is legal. It is constitutional. As a result, you have a bunch of Jim Crow legislation and separate public accommodations based on race becoming commonplace. This leads to things like segregation in bathrooms, segregation in water fountains, segregations in schools, and other things of that nature. With this situation, the case stems from this 1882 incident, 1882 incident, in which African-American train car passenger Homer Plessy refused to sit in a car for black passengers. With that, he's 1/8 black, so his family could pass for white and were considered free people of color. So it's an interesting case to look into, and also to look into the way that people of mixed race are treated as well in this country. We also have World War II. We did talk about this a little bit, I think, with Vietnam and maybe the Korean War and seeing some integrated troops. Progress is made during World War II, and that is kind of the nature of a lot of these things over time. Progress is made. Discrimination is banned in armed forces and defense factories, defense factories. With that, though, you have to understand that even though these things are banned and basically become illegal, that doesn't mean, obviously, that racism and discrimination go away. Though they are banned, you do have forcible integration of troops, which is interesting to see as well with white and black fighting alongside each other. We have different things like An American Dilemma, which is a study of race relations, which brings the idea of prejudice to the forefront. So people are talking about it, right? People are talking about prejudice. They're talking about racism more now than ever. They're talking about discrimination as well. We have also African-American soldiers refusing to accept racism after fighting abroad. This is a thing that you also saw, again, like we talked about with women, women going into factories and helping out with the war effort. And then following that, I know we looked at a couple of those things that were like the Good Housewife's Guide, and women are like, are you kidding me, right? So you kind of have the same situation here as well. With this, we also have Harry Truman doing a sweeping executive order 9,981, and it orders the integration of armed forces following World War II. Using the executive order is a big deal for the presidency. Right? It's a big deal, especially for this situation, because Truman knew that in the South, there were a large amount of what was called the Solid South. Right? It's all white Democrats. This is a prior time before you had the switch between Democrat, Republican, whatever. This is something that they know about. They know that there's a solid South, all white Democrats who would have likely stonewalled any type of integration. So Truman knows that what he needs to do is sign this executive order. He can go over the top of Congress because this is within his powers. And so he does that. So, moving forward, take a look at some of these things. Take a look at de jure segregation. You can see some images up here as well. Like I said with the dining room earlier, like putting something way out of the way, right? Making it an inconvenience overall for anybody who's not white. Same thing with beaches. And then this one, again, absolutely reprehensible the way that it's put. It equates basically Mexican people, black people, to dogs, right? It says no dogs, and then it equates the other two as well. And then you have restrooms, white and colored, colored seat and rear, right? You have all these different things that are happening during the time. Issues with public transportation as well, right? So we see these things. We see racism increasing. Just because integration is happening, just because there is maybe differences in laws at the time, maybe discrimination is banned in some areas and some aspects of life, that does not mean that we're seeing things just magically, solve themselves. We have competition in the job market. We've got a lot of Jim Crow laws of the South. We have what is called de jure segregation, which is segregation by law. This is legally backed, as I would say before, legally backed racism, essentially. Legally backed discrimination. It means that there's actual laws enforcing this, right? Plessy versus Ferguson is part of that too, ruling that segregation is allowed basically as long as things are separate but equal. We also have issues of voting regulation. So even though African Americans are given the right to vote, we have things like the grandfather clause, literacy tests, which even I probably couldn't even pass the way that they were set up. With that, We also have poll taxes, which aims to exclude anybody who might be of the lower class as well. We have segregated schools, segregated transportation, segregated cemeteries as well. And then also segregated beaches and things of that nature. Alongside de jure segregation, we also have de facto segregation, which is basically the other side of this. We have segregation that happens by fact rather than by legal argument, by legal requirement. With this, what that means is that instead of referring to the laws, this form of segregation has been built in and supported by the social customs and institutions of the area. This is kind of like institutionalized racism. With this, you have some segregation in schools, housing, jobs. One of the biggest ones and one of the worst ones, and you still see it to this day, very prominently in many areas, is things like redlining, things like not allowing African Americans into certain neighborhoods or communities. If you know, we talked about the suburbia life, right? White flight to the suburbs. There is very, 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 very low chance that during that time, if you were in an all-white neighborhood, that the realtor there is going to allow an African American family in. So that is what you see. You also see a lot of negative effects, things like higher poverty, which would come from denying people jobs, specifically denying African Americans jobs. And if they are given jobs, oftentimes it is of the lowest wages, which leads into things like generational poverty as well. We also see lower literacy, which comes from, misfunding of schools or lower funding of schools, less home ownership because some people just aren't allowed to probably secure loans or bank loans or able to secure any sort of housing, and shorter life expectancy as well. So we have the difference. So remember, de jure is based in law. De facto is basically institutionalized. It's based in custom or based in social, the way that society's acting. We have Jackie Robinson breaking down the color barrier in baseball. Jackie Robinson, incredibly brave man, also a really, really good baseball player on top of that. He was the first African-American MLB player. I think we talked about this before. There's that movie 42 about Jackie Robinson, really solid movie if you want to check that out. Played for the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. I believe he was also the Rookie of the Year. But even that, it doesn't matter how good of a baseball player you are when you are surrounded by people with a lot of racist ideology. Jackie Robinson faced a lot of death threats. He faced harsh treatment, death threats from fans, harsh treatment from even people that he played on the same team with in his own locker room, in the locker rooms of those who he faced on the field. This is something that you see. But at the same time, again, can't even imagine how brave you must be to go ahead and be the first one to break down something that is so traditionally ingrained. You know, this is an old thing, baseball. It's America's pastime, right? And so Jackie Robinson's ability to kind of break down the color barrier is it's a really, really kind of cool story and something interesting to look into if you haven't read up on it a lot. We have Brown v. Board of Education. With Brown v. Board of Education, this is a U.S. Supreme Court decision. This was in the 1900s, in 1954. Brown v. Board of Education outlawed separate but equal schools. So with this, Brown basically says separate is not equal. Separate is not equal. It repeals the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. In fact, you have all 9 Supreme Court justices supporting the Brown decision here. Implementation, though, this is where it gets interesting. The way that the wording is in a lot of this stuff is where the issues really come from. Implementation was to be conducted with all deliberate speed, which to me and to many people is incredibly vague, right? It doesn't say that, hey, no more separate segregated schools. This needs to be lifted and figured out by September 10th at 12 p.m. or something. No, there's no hard deadline. So what do you think that leads to? Anybody?
Procrastination.
Yeah, maybe purposeful, right?
Obviously.
Yeah. Intentionally waiting and holding off on doing things like segregation or actually doing it because they know that there's no set up, timeline. So with that, what does this mean? It's a vagueness that gave people who were on the side of segregation, basically they're able to take their sweet time, right? And some schools take years and years and years to become desegregated, even though this is a Supreme Court order which penetrates at both state and federal. Yeah.
I think I read somewhere that in 2013, somewhere in Missouri, there was still, like, they just finally got rid of the segregated prom.
Yeah, I'd have to look into it, but you know, nothing really surprises me at this point, to be honest. So, yeah, I'll have to see that. If you find that, send that my way. So, yeah, the big thing with Brown v. Board of Education, you can see here too, ruled unconstitutional, but this is a paper at the time, ruled unconstitutional by Supreme Court, date to end practice not set. That's the big issue here. So yes, it's a great decision, you know, to go through, and we've finally gotten rid of this idea of segregated schools, but at the same time, we're not doing this with, you know, real speed. We're doing this with the speed of those who choose to do it, right? And with this, other cases at the time, there were other cases that were challenging this idea of separate but equal, but they're challenging more so the ability to fulfill it. Brown v. Board of Education instead is challenging directly the principle of separate but equal, and that's where they come up and they say basically that separate but equal it's just not, it doesn't exist, right? So that is part of it. We do have some drama that comes with this, obviously, as you can imagine. We'll talk really quickly with Earl Warren. I think his quote as well is interesting. Does segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race deprive the children of the minority group equal education opportunities? We believe it does. And then this is the part two. You know, people say what they want about this quote. I say, you know, obviously I think it could have been done better, but, you know, at the same time, you have to understand that as a Supreme Court Chief Justice, everything that you say it holds weight, right? And so the way that this is phrased to me is problematic in many ways. With in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. What does that scream to you guys? Anything? In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Maybe private. What else? What about just day-to-day life? We're still going to start seeing that stuff? Any idea? So what it tells me, and what it looks like to me at least, is that yes, in the field of public education, separate but equal is not warranted, right? Yeah, great, okay, but at the same time, it doesn't hit on the idea of, you know, things like segregated bathrooms, segregated water fountains, segregated beaches. Instead, it just targets public education, right? So it's not a sweeping measure that gets rid of a lot of those different things. So a lot of that stuff is still going on. So I think it's important, again, especially if you're somebody who's a Supreme Court Chief Justice, to, you know, it's not to say that he's like a bad guy or anything. It's just that, you know, your words hold weight, and the way that you phrase things matters, right? So this does matter at the time, too. We have the Southern Manifesto. So if you're thinking about opposition to this, it definitely exists. They oppose the implementation of integration, which is basically the opposite of segregation is integration, with all deliberate speed. They pledge to oppose the ruling through all lawful means, whatever that might mean. They are endorsed by 100 congressmen, 100 congressmen. And then you also have things like, you know, the Ku Klux Klan becoming more bold, getting more out there, holding rallies, making themselves more public again. Yes. Yeah. Making themselves more public again. You have something called the White Citizens Council, which is economically and politically pressuring those who complied with desegregation. They have some pull. They've got some weight here. In 1956, politicians from southern states issued the Declaration of Constitutional Principles, also known as the Southern Manifesto. It denounces the Supreme Court decision. The manifesto is signed by 19 senators and 77 members of the House of Representatives from Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. So this is something that goes up into your government too. This is something that goes up into the opposition, and people are basically trying to oppose a Supreme Court ruling, maybe going over checks and balances as well. And then we have the Little Rock Nine. Education does fall into the 10th Amendment of the Bill of Rights, which means that it is a state kind of power. All powers not directly given to the federal government are the responsibility of the states. So you see opposition to it there with that argument as well. Little Rock, Arkansas, in 1957, Governor Orville Faubus orders the Arkansas National Guard to prevent African-American students from attending Central High. You have things like angry mobs harassing students, obviously African-American students. You have President Eisenhower, though, basically saying, oh, you want to call in the Arkansas National Guard? That's fine. because I'm going to call the 101st Airborne Division to enforce desegregation, which is, again, it's kind of like a badass moment, but at the same time, it's also really ridiculous to think that it even needs to come to that. So you have these guys coming in who are basically heroes of the war. World War II's over. They're kind of like a pretty elite branch of the military, and they're coming through specifically to enforce desegregation. So with this, yes, who governs education? Yes, the states do with the 10th Amendment. So that's where a lot of the argument comes from. But at the same time, desegregation is something that is ruled on directly by the Supreme Court, which, as we know, is something that penetrates all levels, federal, state, right? We see the same thing with the legalization of gay marriage as well. An important landmark court case that we saw in our own lifetimes, okay? Just to see how those things kind of are broadly implemented across the United States. So it's not really up to the states here. It's not really up to the governor of Arkansas. This image is, we have Elizabeth Eckford. She is the first of 9 African-American students to arrive. And this is an image of the National Guard basically telling her that we're not going to let you in the building, right? Flip side of that, this is her getting into the building, right? We have the 101st Airborne escorting African-American students into the school as ordered by Eisenhower. There was some, obviously, opposition to this, but by September, all students are enrolled, involved in the school. But again, that doesn't mean that this wasn't probably incredibly difficult. And again, the bravery of these students is an amazing thing to me. To think of the sheer amount of racism and discrimination that they probably felt and faced during the school year, as well as it's not like that went away either, right? So something to think about there. MLK, we got a quote: "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." And that kind of gets directly at what Martin Luther King is all about. So let's talk about him for a minute. MLK, he's a nonviolent leader, obviously, Montgomery, Alabama, 1955. MLK, he's a Baptist preacher who followed the Christian doctrine. A lot of the things that he preaches and talks about is rooted in religion. And also, his background is why he's such a fantastic orator. He's such a really good speech giver, right? He's really, really good at persuasion, all these different things. He's good at leading a movement, He becomes the leader of the movement, in fact. And his big thing is nonviolence, right? His whole goal, his big thing that he preaches mostly is nonviolent protest among the African-American community. He has a couple organizations. He's got the MIA, the Montgomery Improvement Association. He also has the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. With the MIA, King gave a speech that enthralled the people of Montgomery to participate in nonviolent protest. It urged them not to become resentful, which would lead to hate, but to fight with love instead. With the SCLC, this is based on the principles of nonviolence and civil disobedience, became a major force to organizing the civil rights movement. With this, we also have the 6 principles of nonviolence. This is, again, you want this one?
Yeah, I'm going to
Okay. The next thing that we'll talk about is MLK's 6 principles of nonviolence. That's the big thing that we're going to go over with what he's kind of preaching and talking about. Number 1, nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. This is something that King understood. King knew that it was not an easy task to ask his followers or to ask anybody in the civil rights movement to look in the face of violence and discrimination and racism and evil and hatred and to meet that with nonviolence. It's not easy to do that by any means. It's not easy at all. And King knows that. He knows that it is, in fact, actually a lot more difficult to sit through all of those things and meet it with nonviolence. It's a difficult ask, but he knows that that is kind of the way that he wanted to approach things. Number 2, nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. Number 3, nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. A lot of the times, a lot of the things are targeted at defeating institutionalized racism and discrimination as well. Number 4, nonviolence holds that suffering can educate and transform. Number 5, nonviolence chooses love instead of hate, which gets back again to the peaceful protesting. And then number 6, nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of justice. For lack of a better phrase, the best way that I can put the last one would be to say, like the whole phrase of like trust the process, right? Trust the process. Understand that if you go through, King is saying, if you go through with these different things, these different principles that I've set forth for you, then ultimately, the universe is on our side, so that something should come of this. We also have the Montgomery bus boycotts. We have Rosa Parks here. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger, Montgomery, Alabama, again, 1955. African Americans then boycotted the buses in Montgomery, which is always a really, really good plan. If you want to do any sort of nonviolent, peaceful protest, the best place to hit somebody is in the pockets, hit them in the money, right? And so this actually ends up being a really, really good tactic. But with this, you get things like threats from employers. You get threats from the KKK. You get threats from your neighbors. It doesn't matter. The fact is that racism is so ingrained in culture and society in the United States that you do find that very often. It is a really successful and very well done, orchestrated, nonviolent protest, though. In fact, so successful that within a year, Montgomery law desegregated the transportation system. Many of you might not know this, but Rosa Parks was actually not the first black woman to refuse to give up her seat, though this seems to be the way that it's always perceived. There were a couple before her, most significantly probably Claudette Colvin. She was 15 years old. She was arrested for her refusal prior to Rosa Parks. She was defended by the NAACP, and the only charge that stuck was assault, which ironically is probably the dumbest charge that she was hit with. On top of that, she was not used for the movement, right? And this is the part that some people are like, oh my gosh, but she wasn't used for the movement. She wasn't used for this kind of setup in this utilization of the bus boycotting system, because Claudette Colvin, though she was 15 years old, actually became pregnant at a certain point at her young age, and therefore was looked down upon by churchgoers of many areas. So this, more than anything, was actually, with Rosa Parks, was something that was coordinated in many ways, right? And a lot of people don't seem to know that, and I myself didn't know it till a little while ago. But Rosa was the secretary of the local NAACP president, and her refusal to give up her seat was actually something that was planned. Ed Nixon, the president of the NAACP chapter, wanted a case that he could take all the way to the Supreme Court. Rosa was basically like the perfect person to put in this situation: strong, brave, upstanding citizen, and she was on board. So Rosa was aware, this is a quote, that in the last 12 months alone, 3 African-American females have been arrested for the same offense. One incident made the papers in March. It even happened on the same bus line. And then involving Claudette Colvin, again, not to take anything away from Claudette Colvin at all, to be in that situation and to be brave enough to stand up to that as well is still something to be celebrated. But of 4 black passengers asked to surrender their seats in no man's land, 2 refused. An elderly woman and a 15-year-old Claudette Colvin. She said, I paid. I had no reason to move. The elderly woman got off the bus before police arrived. Colvin, however, refused to move, so police dragged her, fighting and crying, to the squad car, where she was rudely handcuffed, which I am sure is an understatement, to say the least. This is just some images of the boycott. You have the kind of like iconic picture of Rosa Parks there. You have images of African-American citizens going around riding bicycles instead of getting on the bus, not paying fees for the bus, right? So that's something, especially if you know a lot about the Southern kind of population at the time. There's a large African-American population in the South, and, to take away that entire demographic from the bus line is going to make an impact, right? And it did so much so that this is something that changed relatively quickly. The next thing that we'll talk about, and absolutely the most difficult thing to talk about in the context of what we're discussing today, would be Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old child. He was a 14-year-old boy, and he was murdered. Emmett was murdered. He was killed for flirting with a white woman, Mississippi, 1955. Emmett's body was sent back home to Chicago, where, as you'll see in a moment, it's really important kind of what his mom does here. And I can't even imagine the ability of her to think through this and be as strong-willed and strong with this entire situation as she was, especially given the image that I will show you guys of Emmett Till's body. Emmett Till was sent back home to Chicago. His body was where his mother held an open casket funeral. And she did this intentionally. She knew that she wanted the world to see what violence, what racism, what discrimination and hatred towards black citizens in the United States what it looks like, basically. Too often people had closed their eyes to this violence. Too often people had ignored and swept under the rug what had been going on. And Emmett Till's mother, in many ways, was able to find something out of the horrific things that happened to her child, even though it is a really, really difficult thing to look at and even talk about. That is again the nature of history. So with this, Emmett Till's death, it picks up a lot of media coverage. Emmett Till's mother knows that, given the brutality of the crime, how horrific the things are that they've done to her child, that she will hold an open casket, and tens of thousands of people attend the funeral. Black, white, all sorts of demographics show up and attend this funeral. And what it does is it actually provides momentum and support for the civil rights movement from all demographics. People see this, and some people for the first time who had been not looking these things in the eyes the way they should have now seen what is going on and how awful this is. And it leads to, not to say that there is anything positive about the situation, but it does lead to something. With it, also, Mississippi defends the murderers. They were acquitted for the kidnapping and murder. Afterward, since they were protected by double jeopardy, the murderers actually went on record to explain and borderline brag about their crimes. So, with the image that I'm about to show you, it is a really difficult thing to see, so do prepare. This is Emmett Till, a 14-year-old child who was brutally murdered and is the victim of severe hatred and racism. With this, in knowing this information, the all-white, all-male jury announced a not guilty verdict on September 23rd, 1955. All but one juror later admitted that they believed Bryant and Millen were guilty of murder, but they chose to acquit them because the mandatory punishment, life imprisonment or death, seemed too harsh to impose upon white men for killing a black boy. Think about that for a moment. 4 months after the trial, Bryant and Millen admitted their guilt in a Look magazine article. The magazine reportedly paid them some $4,000 for their confessions, in which they graphically detailed their abduction of Emmett Till from his uncle's home, admitting that they pistol whipped him, forced him to disrobe, shot him, and dumped his body in the Tallahatchie River. And, to make matters worse, as if they could even, Carolyn Bryant never spoke publicly about the incident. This is the white woman who said that Emmett Till verbally harassed her and basically assaulted her.
Later on, she said that she lied.
Yeah. In 2007, at age 72, she told Duke University senior research scholar Timothy Tyson that she had lied about Till. She lied about Emmett Till. She lied about him having made verbal and physical advances on her. And in a new book, she wrote that nothing that boy ever did could justify what happened to him. 5 decades after Carolyn Bryant testified that 14-year-old Emmett Till had grabbed her and verbally threatened her, she admitted it was not true. And again, it's a difficult thing to look at, and it's even worse when you remember again that Emmett Till was a 14-year-old child who was not guilty of anything, and even if he was, there is no excuse. So this is one of those things that for the first time in many years, some people are seeing without the veil over their eyes, the true brutality of racism in the United States. So following that, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1957 created the United States Civil Rights Commission, the first Civil Rights Act since Reconstruction. So we're seeing more legislation, more delegalization of racism in many ways. We also see the introduction of investigations into violations of civil rights. You guys good to move from this? Next one. All right, last slide. New civil rights movement emerges. So we have television playing a very big role here. We have race, violence, a bunch of things that you're not seeing sometimes being portrayed on television. This is more in people's homes than ever. We have new leaders such as Martin Luther King. We have Malcolm X. We have plenty others too as well to discuss that emerged and were magnetic in gaining followers and organizing protests. And then on top of that all, we have new civil rights organizations creating new opportunities for Black communities to be active in gaining freedoms. Okay, so that is what we have for today. That is the notes for today. Thank you all for listening and paying attention. That is all I have for you guys. So take the rest of class however much time we have, about 30 minutes to work on whatever you guys need to. If you want to work on your project, if you have different assignments that you want to do, you can move on to those. Okay? Yeah, you can if you want. If you want to just throw them in the, whatever the basket is over there.
Well,